This is Glass City Humanist, a show about humanism, humanist values, by a humanist. Here is your host, Douglas Berger.
We look at an update in the case of Dad's Place Church in Bryan, Ohio, where the pastor is ignoring the city by running a homeless shelter in the church. Should religion trump health and safety regulations? And why is the Ohio Attorney General, David Yost, sticking his nose in a local matter? Could it be he's pandering to the religious extremists in the state?
Glass City Humanist is an outreach project of the secular humanists of Western Lake Erie, building community through compassion and reason for a better tomorrow.
Another update on a legal matter that I've covered in the past. And in fact, it was back in February, I believe, when I covered this last time, was the case of Pastor Chris Avell in his church Dad's Place in Bryan, Ohio. Just to refresh your memory on this case, this was Chris Avell has a church in downtown Bryan in the back of an arcade, a video arcade that he also runs. And he decided that due to his religious beliefs that he had to assist homeless people in Bryan. Bryan, Ohio is the county seat of Williams County, and that is the county that's in the northwest corner of the state of Ohio, mostly rural. And Bryan, I believe, is the largest town, the largest city in the county. It's also the county seat. So he decided to start helping homeless people at his church. And one of that help was that he allowed them to stay at his church and sleep, eat, sleep, do laundry, etc. And he ran into trouble with the city because he didn't get any permits. He didn't get any zoning waivers or anything like that. And he also had many code violations, zoning code violations that he wouldn't address. And so the city filed a complaint, took him to court, wanted him to get rid of the homeless shelter. In flies the Christian nationalist legal group First Liberty. They're the same outfit that represents LifeWise. And in fact, one of their lawyers for First Liberty gave testimony for the RTRI bill in Columbus and said that parents did not have a right to have RTRI at public school. And they said that during a testimony. But anyway, so First Liberty swoops in and starts defending him, Chris Avell, saying that it was violating his religious freedom. He wanted to help these homeless people. They said it's part of his religion, his religious beliefs, and that the city, by trying to enforce these zoning codes, were infringing on his religious beliefs. And they filed a federal lawsuit. Well, much later, probably in February, the original case started in December when he was last December 2023 when he was ticketed and the whole process started. And then in January is when they filed the lawsuit in court, and then First Liberty filed a federal lawsuit. And so in February, I believe it was, they came to a mutual decision, compromise, that the city would drop the charges if Chris Avell would start working towards getting the zoning violations corrected. They were going to give him plenty of time to do that, and they wouldn't take him to court or try to punish him for that. Well, it seems that Pastor Avell did not keep up his end of the bargain, and so the city did a surprise fire inspection and cited him again, and this time they filed criminal charges against him, and those are pending. And there was still a court case then got started back up in court about whether or not it was violating his religious beliefs for the city to shut down his homeless shelter. And that was the case that First Liberty's handling. Well, the guy, one of the lawyers for First Liberty, wrote an op-ed that appeared, I think, pretty much in all the newspapers in the state. I know I saw it in the Toledo area. It was published in the Columbus Dispatch, etc. Not only that, but our great benevolent Attorney General David Yost, who, by the way, announced that he's running for governor, weighed in. He inserted himself in by filing a brief in the case, the religious freedom case, in support of Dad's Place Church. And so what happened then next was that the mayor of Bryan wrote a rebuttal op-ed that appeared in all the newspapers again, including the Columbus Dispatch. And that's where I saw it. I saw it in the Columbus Dispatch. And so kind of want to go over some of these details. Other people have written about this case, so I'm not going to get into the weeds on this very much. So the Friendly Atheist, Hemant Mehta, he has a good article summarizing everything that I'm going to talk about with more details than I'm probably going to get into, because I have a couple points that I want to make about this case. So, but anyway, one of the things that I wanted to do was I wanted to play the clip or the interview that David Yost, Attorney General David Yost, did with Tony Perkins, posted on Tony Perkins's YouTube channel on December 11th. So probably the interview was probably the day before or day or two before. And so what I want to do is I want to play this interview for you, the whole video, the whole interview. And then I'm going to talk about some of the points that is made in here. And this is kind of the points that I want to discuss about this case.
Earlier this month, a pastor in Ohio was put on trial, facing criminal charges. His crime? Helping the homeless in his community by giving them a warm place that's open 24/7 so that they can get out of the elements as winter closes in. He says he's doing what the church has been called to do. Yes, but the city of Bryan, Ohio says otherwise. Here now to share about this case is Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost. General Yost submitted an amicus brief, or what's called a friend of the court brief, in this case in support of the pastor and the church. Attorney General Yost, welcome back to Washington Watch. Thanks for joining us.
Good to see you, Tony.
All right, tell us more about this case.
Well, let's start with the basics. Of course, if you've got a public building, you have to comply with the same rules as everybody else. But what the law interpreting the First Amendment says is the government's not allowed to treat the church worse than anybody else. So Dad's Place, I visited there and met Chris Avell, the pastor. Love the work that they're doing there. They take Matthew 25 seriously. The problem is they're in an old building right downtown. The city and the powers that be don't much like them having, folks that are down on their luck hanging out right there. But they are coming in and throwing the book at them on building code violations. Here's the problem. On the stand, the fire chief admitted that they give waivers all the time to these kinds of building code violations if the building is old and it would be too expensive to comply, or if there's some other reason that just the cost of the thing to the business is untenable. And they've actually given a waiver to a hotel where people sleep overnight in beds. So this is just like that case during COVID where the government tried to shut down all the schools, including the Christian schools, and left the casino open. The Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals said you can't treat churches worse than you treat other businesses. And I'm very hopeful that when this is completely litigated, that Dad's Place, well, will still be standing.
So General Yost, are there other factors here? I mean, this would suggest, since they're giving waivers to others, that there could be some animus here on behalf of the city toward this church.
Yeah, and that's a question for the court. But regardless of what they're actually, whether they're against this church or simply don't want, quote unquote, those people, what Jesus called the least of these, hanging around their downtown, the bottom line is, under the law, you're not allowed to treat the church worse than you treat everybody else.
Religious freedom would also, I would think, under the First Amendment, expression of faith, give the church the benefit of the doubt to even have more latitude, because this is a clear expression of the Christian faith.
It's a core function of a core belief of Christianity. In fact, Jesus talks in Matthew 25 about separating the sheep from the goats on the basis of how they act toward the hungry, toward the homeless. Here's another thing. They're trying him last week. They tried him on criminal charges. He might be the first guy in Bryan ever to have been tried on criminal charges. Usually a code violation means you get a ticket. If you ignore the ticket, they might take you to court to get a court order to say you got to fix it or even padlock the front door. But to put somebody in jeopardy of their liberty, they're trying to send a message here. And I'm hearing it, at least.
That's why it sounds like to me there's animus as I've read through the actions that they've taken. But we've also seen hostility from local governments toward churches, and I'm not suggesting it's the case in here, but I've seen it clearly in others, where increasingly city governments do not like churches because they're tax exempt when it comes to property taxes, and they would rather see, and this is a former storefront, which I assume that at some point in time generated tax revenue for the city, is that they don't like churches because they don't make money off of them.
Well, we don't have that in the record, and as former prosecutor, I live and die by the evidence I can produce on the record. What is on the record is that they're treating this church differently than they treat other people in their town, and that's a violation not only of the United States Constitution, but I would argue Section 7 of the Ohio Constitution.
Well, and I'm a radio talk show host, so I probe and try to stir things up a little bit, because I think there's more here than meets the eye. But I want to say thank you, as you have historically done, stepping in defense of the First Amendment, and here a clear, what I see as a clear violation of the rights of this church to help those who are down and out there in the city. So I thank you for stepping in. I thank you for joining us as always. General Yost, always great to see you.
Good to see you. Let me give a quick shout out to First Liberty. This is a privately funded group that is donating their legal expertise along with a couple of local firms to defend Dad's Place.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up, because First Liberty, frequent guests on here, do great work. We're grateful for our partners like them and ADF that step in and do some of the heavy lifting on these cases. General Yost, have a Merry Christmas if I don't see you before Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you.
So that was David Yost talking with Tony Perkins. And I need to point out that Tony Perkins is the leader of the Family Research Council based in Washington, D.C. They are a designated hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. They are anti-LGBT. Tony Perkins is also part of that. He's also an extremist, a conservative religious extremist. And the point, if you look at this, if you go take the link and watch this video, they've got a crawl on his show that gives like some brief headlines. And one of them was they were celebrating that Daniel Perry guy, the guy that choked out the guy on the New York subway who was having a mental breakdown, choked him out and killed him. And he was found not guilty of manslaughter. in a court in New York this month. On the crawl, they were celebrating. They said Daniel Perry is a hero or something like that. They were celebrating him as a hero. You know, this is a Christian. This is a guy who wears his Christianity on his sleeve and quotes the Bible all the time, et cetera, et cetera. And he's celebrating some guy who murdered somebody because he was having a mental health break, a mental health issue. Like he deserved to die, I guess, is how his thing. Anyway, so that's Tony Perkins and the Family Research Council. So it's apropos that they had David Yost on. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk about what David Yost was referring to, that when a government has regulations or laws, that they're not allowed to treat churches worse than any other non-church entity. And he brought up the pandemic. Now, this was what they call one of those shadow Supreme Court cases. Andrew Seidel talks about that in his book about weaponizing the Supreme Court for religious zealots. And it was a shadow ruling in that they didn't have any, it wasn't processed. It was like an emergency decision. They didn't have briefs and you didn't show up at court and argue it. They had people submit briefs and then they made the ruling because of exigent whatever they call it, the emergency stuff. And so they call it a shadow docket. And the Supreme Court ruled that laws that shut down places because of the pandemic had to treat churches exactly like they treated other businesses. And one of the arguments that was used during that time period, and Yost reiterated it, was that casinos were allowed to stay open. Grocery stores were allowed to stay open. And what it was essential business, mostly essential, anything that was designated an essential business was allowed to stay open. If it wasn't an essential business, then it had to close. And so the argument was made that churches are essential business. The Supreme Court agreed. I did not agree with that because it's the whole thing about having religion in a building, that you have to, in order to have freedom, religious freedom, you had to be able to be in a church. You know, they made that same argument when the health departments closed the public schools. They closed all the schools in Lucas County, and the religious schools filed a lawsuit saying it was infringing on their religious freedom.
For more information about the topics in this episode, including links used, please visit the episode page at glasscityhumanist.show.
So basically what Yost's argument is that religious freedom should trump regulations. That's what he's saying. That's clearly what he's saying. And of course, I don't agree with that. I don't believe that. Dad's Place and Chris Avell are not being treated worse than any other. He talks about, Yost mentions about a hotel and I think First Liberty in their editorial, and I'll have a link on the show notes, talked about how a hotel and a senior center was allowed to not have to have sprinklers, and they were given a waiver. Why wasn't Dad's Place given a waiver? Well, it's perfectly explainable if you look at the details of the case and the timeline. The hotel and the senior center and the shelters that are also there's 2 shelters downtown, including one right next to Dad's Place. They were all in operation prior to 2017. 2017, the fire code changed. Chris Avell started his homeless shelter in 2023 or 2022, something like that. So in order for him to comply with the codes, he would have to apply with the current codes. since he would not have been in business before the codes were established. That's what municipalities mean by grandfathering something in. Was this place established? Was this place operating as this thing prior to the code change? And if not, then they have to abide by the current code. That's why they talk about when they're doing renovations for old houses. A lot of times places won't do much renovating because if they do, then they have to comply with the current building codes. And a lot of these old homes and old buildings weren't built during the time that those current codes were existing. And so it's hard to retrofit them. So it's reasonable for the hotel to have a waiver because they were established before the code changed. And so that was the argument that Yost makes there in his little interview with Tony Perkins. And it's pretty ironic, too, that that's the same argument that First Liberty is making in their court case. They filed an appeal from the municipal or the county court. I think it was the county court ruled against Avell. There's been 3 court cases that have ruled against Chris Avell in the county. The other thing that I want to point out, too, is that Williams County is not a liberal bastion of anti-religion. Williams County is about as red as you can get. They voted for Trump. 73% of the county voted for Trump. All the people that are involved, the fire chief, the mayor, Bryan, other city officials, they are all Christians. They go to church. Now, one of the arguments, though, that I agree with that First Liberty brings up and David Yost mentions is that city fathers or the city administrators don't want another homeless shelter downtown. That would be a valid criticism of the city, that they are nitpicking, well, using their phrase, First Liberty's phrase, nitpicking, and really trying to enforce the rules because they just don't want a homeless shelter downtown, another one. And that plays into some of the way this case has been going. In an earlier news story about it, they talked about how the city tried to find Dad's place another location, and they were going to move it. They wanted to move him to an industrial area of town, or a town where they had more like manufacturing factory or non-downtown area. And he refused. The other point also to make that's not being addressed by Yost or First Liberty is the fact that he complied with the zoning laws when he established the business, because it wasn't zoned to be a church, and he wanted to put a church in the back of the store. This is a church in the back of a retail store. It was zoned for commercial purposes. So he had to get a waiver to put a church in. And one of the stipulations when they gave him the waiver was that he had to abide by the zoning regulations. And he refuses to do that. He has continually refused to do it. He believes that he doesn't have to because it's about his religious freedom. And so that is also where, this religious privileging goes. That anytime that a religious group has to abide by a law that everybody else has to abide by, and they don't like the law, then they claim that it's infringing on their religious beliefs. Now, I don't know too many religious beliefs where you could just not follow the law. I mean, it starts with the religion, right? The whole premise of a religion is that your deity's laws, you have to follow your deity's law. But they don't think since it's not their deity's law, that they don't have to follow it. And I disagree on that. Now, I also have the link for the Mayor Bryan and her rebuttal. The one thing that concerned me about the whole rebuttal was the fact that they were pointing out a registered sex offender had been staying there at the Dad's Place shelter, their quasi shelter, and how that was just, they needed to protect the children. That just bothers me. All right. Because no matter what your status in life, whether you're a criminal that has served your time, or you're a registered sex offender. If you're a registered sex offender, it means you've done your time and you're out. And I have a problem. I understand that you shouldn't leave a registered sex offender alone with children. I get that. I agree with that. But a lot of places now restrict where registered sex offenders can even live. You can't live next to a church, you can't live next to a school. In some places, you can't live in the same block as a school. Because they don't want registered sex offenders in their community. It looks like it should be that they served their time and they should be allowed to exist. And many people just want to continue to punish them for the rest of their lives. Yes, you should watch them. Yes, they should be restricted from working with children and being alone with children. But they don't do that with these Catholic priests that get convicted of child abuse. They don't force them to live in an industrial area in a trailer like some places in California. Talk about religious privileging. I guess child abuse has a religious flavor. I don't know how about that. But I was just concerned about the way that they kind of harped and the title of the that the Dispatch used for the mayor's rebuttal was Bryan Mayor, sex offender, kids slept on church floor. My city needed to step in. Yeah, that is almost as bad as Yost nosing in on this case and making it all about religious freedom. There's valid concerns why they have issues with having a homeless shelter in that church, in that building. He's violated zoning ordinances. He refuses to fix them, and then he should be prosecuted for that. And the other thing too to mention is, they're talking about impeding his religious freedom. Most of the time, if it's not a church, they would have shut the place down and locked it up and prevented people from going into it or using it. That's one of the actions that a city can take when somebody violates zoning regulations, is they can, especially if it's a business, they can shut you down, close your business, lock your doors. Health departments, if you violate health department regulations, they can take your license away and shut you down, and you have to close, I think 7 days at least, minimum. They have the authority to do that. And they did not do it in this case. They didn't shut the church down because he had religious freedom. They were protecting his religious freedom. As long as he didn't do the homeless shelter part, he could operate his church. And of course, he took advantage of that fact and still had people sleeping there, even after they told him not to do that. If you're going to violate the law, you need to be open to the consequences, even if you don't agree with the law. Even if the law is inappropriate and racist or derogatory or whatever, you still need to, because that's the only way you can fight a bad law, is being injured by it, and then you fight it in court. You don't just ignore it. And a lot of Christians, a lot of people that consider themselves Christians tend to ignore that fact. You know, I'm pretty sure the Bible says that if you ignore God's law, you're going to hell. And they wouldn't debate me on that because they would agree with that. Well, if that's the case with religious law, what about secular law? If you ignore secular law, shouldn't you be punished for that? Many people say yes, even though we have more than a two-tier system of justice in this country. You know, but the main thing is about this story with Dad's Place, the Dad's Place update, is that First Liberty is coming in, raising money off of it. Chris Avell's getting some of that conservative welfare. They're making it all about religious freedom. The city has good reasons to be concerned and to hold him accountable for the health and safety of the people that stay in that building. But on the other hand, too, I really think that the city just doesn't want another homeless shelter downtown. And so they're being very tough on him. They want him to move to another part of town that is not downtown. And it also, all these actions and recriminations and court cases still doesn't solve the problem of the homeless issue in Williams County and Bryan.
Thank you for listening. For more information about the topics in this episode, please visit the episode page at glasscityhumanist.show. Glass City Humanist is an outreach of the Secular Humanists of Western Lake Erie. Sholi can be reached at humanistswle.org. Glass City Humanist is hosted, written, and produced by Douglas Berger, and he's solely responsible for the content. Our theme music is Glass City Jam, composed using the Amplify Studio. See you next time.